Hey, Crawlspace listeners, we've got something really exciting for you this holiday week. We've got 6 episodes that have never been aired on Crawlspace that are airing 6 days in a row. Now, these are all episodes of Missing that have aired on the show Missing in the past year, but they're all connected because they're part of the Bennington Triangle disappearances from Vermont. And the disappearances range from 1945 to 1950. And we produced this series with our buddy Ross Griffiths, who is an archives librarian from Worcester State University. And the 6th episode is a conversation between Lance and I and Ross Griffiths and Joseph Citro, the man who coined the term Bennington Triangle. So really interesting stuff. Really hope you like it. Let us know what you think on Spotify or YouTube.
We spoke with this gentleman many, many weeks ago, and the episode that he did was one of the most classic episodes of Missing that I can remember. He's truly an articulate, knowledgeable historian when it comes to these disappearances, and the area that we're talking about today is one that is endlessly fascinating. But Tim, I've gone on long enough.
Very excited to speak today with Ross Griffiths, and we speak about the disappearance of Middie Rivers from November 12th, 1945. And he was a 74-year-old man who disappeared while hunting in Bickford Hollow. And so that's near Route 9 in Vermont. And of course, Lance, Middie's disappearance is the first if we're speaking about the Bennington Triangle disappearances. And that is a whole nother subject that we speak about a little bit in this conversation. But I just want to throw out there that Joseph A. Citro actually coined the term Bennington Triangle. And he is someone we've reached out to. So we're trying to get him on the show to be a part of this conversation as well. And
the Bennington Triangle we mentioned with Ross in this conversation is one of the areas that we've determined to be a lesser known geographical mysterious location. We have the Bermuda Triangle, the Bridgewater Triangle, and we have heard of the Bennington Triangle, but really didn't look into it too much. And I'm not sure why, because it's, as Ross says, just as mysterious as the others without the supernatural element. And I think that's what makes it even more unsettling for me. But I will get into that more after the interview in our final thoughts.
Okay, so we're going to throw it to the interview with Ross Griffiths in just a moment, but just want to remind you to follow us on social media at Missing CSM. And if you want to see this show in video form, check us out on Spotify. We're going to cut to commercial real quick, and we'll be right back with Ross Griffiths. Welcome back to the podcast. Ross Griffiths, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, absolutely. You're more than welcome to come back on the show anytime you'd like. I wish that we had an audio drop of applause, because the last time you joined us, your episode was so good. We got such great feedback. You're like a show hero now. Anyone who hasn't listened to that episode or they're unfamiliar with you, can you tell us who you are, a little bit about your background, maybe a little bit about why you were on the show previously?
Yeah, my name is Ross Griffiths. I'm an archives librarian at Worcester State University. And along with doing library stuff and archive stuff, I have an interest in, historical mysteries and folklore and urban legends. And I discovered this missing persons case involving a Worcester State student from back in the 30s that was, I think, had a lot of interesting twists and turns. I wanted to explore it a little bit. And once I read up on it, I thought it would be right up your guys' alley. So that led to the episode about Etta Reel.
Yeah, fascinating case. And we even heard, and I think you did as well, heard from some of Etta's family after the recording, which was very interesting and unexpected, I will say, because the case took place about 100 years ago.
Yeah, it was 90 years ago, but I think it informs us about how long people's memories are, especially when it's a family member. You have these family stories, things that happened to your grandparents, your great-grandparents. And even though I think the public doesn't remember this case anymore, the people who were close to it do remember. And I think it's one of the reasons why when you talk about true crime cases, you need to keep all of that in mind and don't assume that there aren't people out there who are still emotionally invested in something, because they often are.
Right. Like, what a great example as well when, covering something that Tim said is like 100 years old. There's still people out there who care about this person, and we can't just let the passage of time be a excuse or a reason for not taking it as seriously as something that happened 6 months ago or a year ago.
Yeah, but I also think that the passage of time sometimes takes off some of the rough edges. Recent true crime, recent disappearances still feel very, very raw. And I think when you go back 50 years, 100 years, I think those of us who aren't emotionally invested, I think there's a kind of barrier there that makes it feel less emotionally charged. And you can sort of get more into the mystery of it. But I don't think we should lose sight that our mysteries are somebody else's real life.
Yeah, no doubt. And, well, thank you for treating this subject with such great respect. We appreciate that.
Sure.
And so now you're back joining us to speak about some other disappearance cases, and some of them have kind of been grouped together into something called the Bennington Triangle.
Yes.
Before we speak about any specific person, can you tell us a little bit about this this term and this area?
The Bennington Triangle describes a kind of conjectural space in southern, sort of southwestern Vermont, in which there have been a number of mysterious disappearances over the past 80 years. Now, there are 5 really canonical disappearances, 5 people that disappeared between 1945 and 1950. And then there are some extraneous disappearances that are sometimes pulled into this, but it's a little bit less clear as to whether they're part of this larger pattern. What makes it an interesting case is that none of these people had any relationship to each other. They were people from different walks of life, and each of them disappeared under different circumstances. So it doesn't necessarily seem like they have anything in common other than they happened in this area. The boundaries of the triangle are a little bit unclear, partly because one of the people disappeared while he was in transit between one place and another. And so no one's sure exactly where he disappeared, but I think there's actually some good evidence as to the location, at least the town where this guy disappeared, north of Bennington. So it's a very large geographical area. It composes the town of Bennington, some of the towns around it, but it also comprises a pretty large area, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of wooded acres in the Green Mountains. And the Green Mountains really are the backdrop for much of what happened in this case. It's important to note as well, the concept Bennington Triangle, the term, was introduced by a Vermont-based author named Joseph Citro, back in the late 80s, early 90s. Some of you might recognize that name. He wrote a book about weird New England. So it's kind of like a road tripper's guide to cool, weird stuff to see in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Vermont and Maine. But he began writing about and talking about the Bennington Triangle about a little over 30 years ago. But the idea that something strange was happening in this area really dates back about 75 years to when these disappearances were occurring. There was an article in the local newspaper from 1950 saying, "Is there a lost horizon around Glastonbury Mountain?" Now, they were referencing a popular novel that was later made into a movie about a group of travelers who became lost in the mountains of Tibet and sort of discovered a mystical kind of place. It's the story that popularized the term Shangri-La. And so I think the implication was that, is there some mystical force drawing people off the trail, drawing people away from where they're supposed to be into the forest? So this isn't something that was invented by a blogger or a journalist decades after it occurred. And the reason I bring that up is because we have in southeastern Massachusetts the so-called Bridgewater Triangle, but that seems like something that was created in the early 2000s, when people began sort of pulling together folk legends from the area around Bridgewater and the Hockomock Swamp. Whereas this is an area that had a strange reputation, at least from the time at which, or at least maybe not the area, but the events themselves led people to think something strange was happening in the area all the way back to when these events occurred.
Wow, that's great. And would you say that you mentioned the Bridgewater Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know about other famous triangles, the Bermuda Triangle. Would you say that the Bennington Triangle is sort of overlooked? Like it's one of the lesser known ones?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's more of a regional thing that people in the area might have heard about it, or people who follow folklore in New England or who follow blogs or listicles about cool, weird stuff in New England would know about it. But it isn't something I think that's gotten a lot of national attention. It seems pretty localized. There is a Wikipedia page about it, though, that's pretty good.
Yeah, there is. And I hadn't really heard much of the supernatural being connected with the Bennington Triangle, whereas it kind of is in the other triangles, certainly the Bermuda Triangle and the one in Massachusetts as well. But yeah, so not really too much here, but except with this Lost Horizon speak, that's pretty interesting.
And I think the sort of paranormal aspects of the Bennington Triangle are not as clear. You know, if you talk about the Bridgewater Triangle, there are very distinct stories about cryptids and various other things, Native American legends. Whereas the Bennington Triangle just seems sort of like, we're not sure what's going on. What's causing people to walk into the woods and disappear, and where are they going? It seems a little more vague and sinister, I think. But I don't think we need a supernatural explanation. I think one of the things that got me interested in this is I'm really fascinated with fact versus folklore, this idea that real events happen, and then in retelling those events are transformed in some way to be either more mysterious or more threatening or something. And so what I was really interested in looking at was what really happened. What does the original source material say? Newspaper articles, public records databases, anything that's available. And then how does that differ from subsequent retellings? And at the time, I think, while people were very aware that something strange was happening, there wasn't a lot of real folklore around it. It was just kind of a head scratcher for people. And I think subsequent to that, I think there are aspects to these disappearances which have been amplified. There are facts that have gotten mixed up. And there are people who have injected various kinds of theories as to what might have happened, some of which are supernatural. I don't think we need any supernatural or mystical stuff to recognize that these are weird cases, that they're strange, that there was something at least statistically anomalous about these people disappearing.
You're so right on that. I'm nodding enthusiastically because you sent us articles about the disappearances, and these are old articles from back when it first happened, and the reporting on them is very ominous. You don't need something new to be injected in there that gives some supernatural element. It is very, maybe it's in the way that they're writing it back then, but it does give you this feeling of being very unsettled. And yeah, so I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that part of what unsettled people was that when people went missing in the woods, they always were found. And that was one of the questions I had. I'm like, there's a lot of wilderness out there. It's a pretty wild area. Parts of it are. So how unusual is it really for people to disappear in the woods? And I went through, I'd say, about 50 years of newspapers from the 1890s up to the 1940s. And I really couldn't find other cases of people who disappeared completely. There were a few cases, a lot of teenage runaways disappear. They're found safe weeks or months later. There's a guy who disappeared with the proceeds of a charity picnic and was not seen again. That's not a big mystery. He stole money and ran away. There are one or two instances of people who kind of left home in a quote unquote deranged state of mind. Now, some of this could be what we would today refer to as dementia or some sort of mental illness. If you look at missing persons cases today, it's not unheard of that elderly people sometimes have wandered away from care homes or caregivers, but nothing that was a complete and total disappearance. And that's because when someone goes off into the woods, they usually don't get that far off the trail. And somebody finds them alive or deceased, usually hunters, sometimes weeks later, months or years later. But in all of these cases began with absolute certainty that these people were going to be found either dead or alive. And I think that ominous feeling that you detected was this frustration, this sense of why aren't we finding these people?
And you're going to be bringing these other stories of these missing persons to us. What is it, in your opinion, that is important about retelling these stories?
I think partly just to remember these people, who they were. They had lives, they had families. Their cases are unresolved. In all but one case where a body was found, we don't know what happened to them. But I also want to remind people that when you hear folklore about something, go back to the original source and see what actually happened. We live in this amazing time where you can sit at your desktop computer in your living room and go back and read the original accounts of events like this that happened 75 or 80 years ago, and kind of tease out the facts of what happened versus the ways in which the stories have been retold over time. And that's an advantage that people didn't have even 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, I found articles from the early 2000s about these cases that contained a number of inaccuracies, but those journalists didn't have ready access to the original source material that we have today. And so we have opportunities today to kind of set the record straight about the way that things happened.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit about this man that we're going to speak of, Middie Rivers?
Sure. Middie Rivers is the first of the 5 disappearances in these sort of canonical cases. He has an unusual first name, and that was one of the first things I was curious about, is what is his actual name? From all the documents I've been able to find, it's Middie. It's Middie. His parents were Canadian from the French-speaking provinces. Is it possible that he had a name that made a little more sense in French Canada and less down here, and it became Middie? I'm not sure. But if you look at census records and other public documents, it's always Middie Rivers. Interestingly enough, Middie Rivers was from the Worcester, Massachusetts area. He was born in Marlborough. He lived much of his adult life here in Worcester. He married his wife, Annie, in the old Notre Dame church, which people in Worcester, where I'm talking from today, would remember on the Worcester skyline until relatively recently. But by the early 1920s, he had relocated with his wife and a couple of grown children to the Bennington area and was settled there. And he worked a variety of different kinds of blue-collar jobs. He worked in a shoe factory. He was a house painter. He was a weaver. At the time of his disappearance, he was working in a printing factory, a place that was manufacturing, greeting cards and wrapping paper and those kinds of things. He was 74 years old, and I think that we can sort of present him as somebody who's in pretty good physical shape. He was known as being a very skilled outdoorsman. His son-in-law, with whom he resided, whose name was Joe Luzon, had a hunting camp a couple miles outside Bennington where they spent weekends. By 1945, Rivers was a widower of about 10 years. His wife had passed back in the mid-30s. Her obituary was very moving. She was described as being a very saintly person, someone who was a real church woman, somebody who had a great spirit of charity and generosity to her neighbors. This was during the Great Depression, where a lot of people were, I think, having pretty hard times. And so she was a very charitable, kind of giving person, really mourned by the community. And so that gives us maybe a little picture of what his home life was like with this wife of his. By 1945, he's 74. He's traveling out to this area along the Long Trail. Now, let's talk for a moment about the geography of Bennington. So Bennington's in the southwestern corner of Vermont. It's just a few miles. A few miles to the west is the line with New York State. A few miles to the south is Massachusetts. And then about 5 miles to the east are the Green Mountains. And in this particular area of the Green Mountains is Glastonbury Mountain, which is, I think, the second highest peak in Vermont. It really looms large in the eastern horizon. And this area of the mountains has an interesting history. Back in the middle of the 19th century, it was the center of a logging industry. So portions of the mountains had been clear-cut. There were logging roads, there were public roads all through the mountains. There were a couple of towns in the mountains that had been logging towns. But as the 19th century came to a close, the logging industry was in decline, and the area became a center of recreational activity. The logging company began leasing out parcels of land for people to build hunting cabins and weekend cottages. It became a place for sightseeing. The towns that were there dwindled in population to the point they became ghost towns. And this is a good point where we might want to talk about fact versus folklore. If you listen to more current retellings of the Bennington Triangle cases, people will say that the mountains in this area had a sinister reputation, that the logging industry declined because loggers were disappearing in the woods. And there were Native American legends about Glastonbury Mountain being a sort of haunted place. But if you look at contemporary accounts, the opposite seems to be true. This area was described as an area of great natural beauty. In the 1870s, you can find articles describing Glastonbury Mountain as having a growing reputation for weekend excursions, people traveling to get fresh mountain air. And this was a time, I think, when Americans were getting more interested in the outdoors. So all through this particular area of the Green Mountains, there were hunting cabins and weekend cottages and small kinds of hostelries for hunters.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So let's travel about 5 miles east of Bennington on Route 9. This is an east-west highway that runs through the south of Vermont. At a point about 5 miles west, there is an intersection with a road called Harbor Road. And Harbor Road goes north up toward Glastonbury Mountain through these mountains. It's like a rural neighborhood. There are year-round houses, there are summer cottages. Back in the 1940s, the Long Trail, which is a major hiking trail through Vermont, had been around since the 1920s, paralleled this road. Today, the trail heads a little bit farther to the east, but in the 40s, it was paralleling this road. So the Luzon hunting camp, if you went up this trail, paralleling the road, about 3 or 4 miles, is where you'd come to the camp. So it's a place that's isolated but not remote, if that makes sense. You're in this very dramatic topography, very, very steep hills, hollows, creeks, swamps, woods, but you're only a couple miles north of Route 9 and a rural neighborhood and a little village called Woodford. So it's a nice place to go. It's close to town, but it's kind of up in the woods, away from things. If you go north from this camp, you go farther and farther into the wilderness. Harbor Road kind of peters out, and the Long Trail continues all the way up Glastonbury Mountain, but you get farther and farther away. So let's keep that in mind as we talk about the Middie Rivers case. So it was the weekend of November the 10th, 1945. Rivers and his son-in-law had traveled out to this hunting camp. They'd spent the weekend there with a few other people. There are some various stories about the last sighting of Rivers, but the best one I was able to find was one of the earliest newspaper articles about this. On Monday, which would have been the 12th, Rivers had gone out hunting. There was a guy named Hollis Armstrong who had traveled with Rivers and a few other people to this camp for the weekend. He was on a ridge opposite the Luzon hunting camp. So this is across the hollow. And it's 4:00 in the afternoon. Hollis Armstrong is heading back to camp. Now, if you know the northeastern US, 4:00 in mid-November, it's getting dark. It's time to head back to camp. Hollis Armstrong's heading back to camp. He encounters Middie Rivers on the trail walking the opposite direction. And they chat for a couple of minutes. And before they part ways, Armstrong says to Rivers, "Hey, you're going the wrong way. Camp is this way. You should come back with me." And Rivers assured him he knew exactly where he was going. He knew what he was doing. He would see him back at camp. That is the last sighting of Middie Rivers, walking away from the camp very late in the afternoon after a very uneventful weekend of hunting. When Armstrong gets back to camp, Rivers never returns, and the group that's out there immediately begins searching for him.
I just wanted to interject here with with one point and one question.
Mm-hmm.
I had looked up the average life expectancy of a male in the 1940s, and that's 62 years old. So he was already 13 years past the average life expectancy. And you said that by all accounts, he was in really good shape. Do you attribute that really good shape to him being an outdoorsman?
I would say so. He seems like a guy who stayed pretty active. You know, one of the things people say is when you get older, the worst thing you can do is to be sedentary and sit around the house. This guy was working a job. He might have been working a part-time job, but he was still working. And he was out in the woods every weekend. And he was living with his family. You know, he had his daughter and his son-in-law and his granddaughter in the house. So he had family support. I think this guy was you sort of get a sense he's a pretty active, energetic guy.
Okay. And this is a really mysterious way that he goes missing. He's going in the opposite direction that he should be going in, but apparently he's collected enough to provide an answer that seemed reasonable for the person who spoke to him. And I don't know if I'm kind of forcing this question in here, but this was also after the end of World War II. Do you think that any part of the story of him disappearing was influenced by anything that came from maybe paranoia about the war or some sort of residual, I don't know, effect that maybe the press had been putting out there about the war? Like, were people on edge?
I think by the fall of 45, people were actually really happy that the war was over. There was a great deal of celebration and relief. And so I don't know that the post-war climate necessarily played a direct role in it. But as we'll see, the search had a connection with some World War II soldiers, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that's an interesting point to bring up, that we had just finished this kind of major national crisis, and there was kind of this sense of relief that everybody was experiencing. And I'm sure that Rivers was sort of caught up in that in his own kind of way. But I think that the point that you brought up about him acting normally is important. When he disappeared, one of the concerns was that he'd suffered some kind of medical event of some kind. But it was very clear that when he was last seen, he was behaving normally. He was dressed appropriately. He's wearing very heavy woolen clothing. Now, the clothing that hunters wore decades ago would have been wool and cotton, no synthetics. They wouldn't have had these bright orange colors like we have today. But you picture sort of a heavy wool jacket, sweater, heavy wool pants, boots, a hat, and he was carrying a gun. He was armed, and he probably had a hunting knife on him. He might have had other kinds of tools that he could use. So he was equipped to be out in the woods hunting, but it's unclear as to why he'd be heading in the opposite direction, quite a distance away from the camp so late in the afternoon. Now, I've speculated, and it's pure speculation on my part, maybe these guys had a friendly rivalry. Maybe they all had pulled game, maybe they had all gotten game that weekend and he hadn't. And he sort of thought he was going to go out and try to bring back a pheasant or something like that. But it was odd that he was headed out that late in the day, and where exactly was he going? So the alarm is raised fairly early on, but it's late in the day. So a couple of members of this hunting party driving to Bennington, they tell the police, and they plan a search party for the next morning, which is Tuesday. And as the day progresses, they're not getting as many searchers as they want. And so they have a signal to call a search party. If the firehouse sounds the siren 333 three times in quick succession, that's the announcement in town that a search party is needed. That tells us that there are a lot of people in this town who are good at searching for people. They're accustomed to doing it. Hunters get lost. They have a system for finding lost hunters. And these search parties were gathered Tuesday and Wednesday, and they proceed into this area around the Luzon hunting camp, and in particular on that ridge where Rivers was last seen. So they're going with the idea that this guy may have had a heart attack, maybe he fell and sprained his ankle. There's a sense of real urgency in the early days of a search. This person's still alive. They're looking for evidence of a campfire or an overnight shelter. They're not finding anything. They're fanning out in a sort of northeast, north, and northwesterly direction from where Rivers was last seen, without any luck at all. By the weekend, they've called up soldiers from Fort Devens. This is the military base in sort of north central Massachusetts. They got like 100 guys from Fort Devens to come out. These are guys who had served in the European theater of war. They had a lot of experience. They bring a field kitchen with them. They set up a tent cooking food for these searchers. They call in members of the Vermont State Guard. At one point, there are hundreds of searchers crawling all through the area around the camp, north of the camp, along the long trail. The particular area we're talking about here is called Bickford Hollow. It's a sort of narrow ravine that runs north and south from the base of Glastonbury Mountain south. There's Bickford Creek running through the hollow. They're searching the hollow. They've turned the armory in Bennington into a dormitory for all of these searchers. So this is a major, major search operation. And they're not finding any trace of this guy anywhere and can't figure out where he would have gone. While the men were searching for Rivers, some of his women relatives went to a local psychic. There was a woman who lived in Pownell, south of Bennington, named Clara Jepson. And Clara Jepson had a reputation for finding lost things. She had apparently helped the Rockefellers find a expensive diamond necklace. She was consulted by journalists when the Lindbergh baby disappeared, when Amelia Earhart disappeared. She didn't seem to offer any clues for those cases, but she seemed to be good enough at finding lost things that there were often cars parked in front of her house. Mrs. Jepson had an unusual technique that I've actually never heard of before. She wouldn't take money, but you had to bring her a clean handkerchief. And she'd sit down at a table and she'd have it's an oblong box on the table, and she'd drape the handkerchief over the box. And she would take the ends of the handkerchief and she would draw it back and forth over this square box. And by looking at the folds and the wrinkles in the handkerchief, she would get these images of where your lost object was. And she had a very distinctive physical appearance. She had one blue eye and one brown eye. And she said it was the blue eye that had the second sight. So some of Rivers' relatives went to talk to Mrs. Jepson, and she said that Middie Rivers was near a dilapidated shack in the woods, and he was lost. And he was walking down a hill to a creek, and he grabbed his chest and fell over dead under a tree. Now, obviously it's in the middle of the woods. The tree clue isn't great, but the shack was an interesting detail. The creek was an interesting detail. Nobody in the search party could figure out this location. It never led anywhere, but it did give searchers something to think about. And of course, it introduced the idea that Rivers had died, that this was no longer a search operation. It was a recovery operation. And as the weeks went on, the search parties got fewer and fewer. Interest didn't really decline, but they realized we're looking for a deceased person here. And soldiers go back to Fort Devens, the Vermont National Guard people return. And gradually, the story begins to disappear. But everybody is absolutely convinced that they're going to find Middie Rivers in the spring. And after the snow comes, the searches all stop. Searches resume in April of 46. They're putting ads in the newspaper. They're asking people to come out and participate in these search parties. In the middle of May of 1946, a local woman is hiking in what was described as the foot of Bickford Hollow. So this is a little bit south of where Rivers was last seen. And along a trail, she sees something and she picks it up. It's a blue handkerchief. And tied up inside the handkerchief is 30 cents of change. And the handkerchief has some stains on it. It happens that while she found this, there was a search party out there. So she goes to the search party. She gives them the handkerchief. They identify it as the handkerchief that Middie Rivers carried with him. They took it to Benmont Paper Company where he worked, and they said the stains on this handkerchief matched the ink that he was working with when they were printing Christmas wrapping paper the previous fall. So clearly found this object. The question was, why didn't the searchers find it? I think based on these newspaper articles, descriptions of the search, I think the area was too far south. I think the area where this was found had not been heavily searched by searchers. They were concentrating up north because remember, if Middie Rivers had walked south within a couple of miles, he would have found Route 9. He would have been back in civilization. He would have found his way home again. So they probably hadn't concentrated too heavily on this area. But I think it's very interesting that this woman happens to find this clue. I've wondered if maybe she was one of those hikers who was looking for mushrooms or wildflowers, and she was just paying very close attention to the trail, and other people hadn't really seen it. But that handkerchief is the only trace of Middie Rivers that was ever found. No bones, no clothing, the gun, nothing. the theories at the time really weren't very helpful. People didn't know what to make of it. Obviously, maybe he had a medical emergency, maybe he got lost, but where would he have gone that was so remote that nobody would ever have found him in the year later, or 2 years later, or 3 years later? They speculated at the time that he might have been accidentally shot by other hunters. And part of that is because about a few decades before this happened, a prominent citizen in this area, which is near the town of Woodford in Vermont, had actually been killed in a hunting accident in that general area. And that seemed to be part of public memory. So people said, well, maybe the same thing happened to him. But it doesn't explain where the body would have been. So whatever happened to him seems to have happened in a place that was so remote that a very exhaustive search by people who were very familiar with the area and skilled with searching didn't find any trace of him, and that no subsequent hikers or hunters or anybody ever found him. And that's really where Middie Rivers' story ends. There were no further developments after about the summer of 46. They were still searching in July, but the story begins to gradually disappear from the newspapers. And I think people come to the conclusion that he's somewhere out there, but maybe we'll never find him.
Okay, now we're going to hit you with some questions.
Sure.
And the first one that comes to mind is about the handkerchief and the location of it. Was it found on the other side of Route 9, or was it found before Route 9?
It was found, the whole area we're talking about is north of Route 9. So it was actually on the correct side of Route 9, but it was south of where Rivers was last seen. Maybe, based on what I've been able to pull together, maybe a mile or so south in the woods. So it was the general vicinity, but probably not the area that would have been heavily searched. Because again, if he had been on the foot of Bickford Hollow, the southern part of Bickford Hollow, he would have been close enough to Route 9, to Harbor Road, that he probably would have found his way home. The other thing to keep in mind is there are a number of waterways that come through this area. There are 3 creeks that come together and they empty into I'm probably going to get the name wrong. It's the Walloomsek Creek, which runs under Route 9. Had he found one of these creeks and he was okay to walk, he would have followed the creek south, and that would have taken him to Route 9. If you're lost in the woods, you can find the moss on the tree. If the moss is on the north side of the tree, you walk south. So it seems like he was either incapacitated or he was far enough away that he was disoriented and just couldn't find his way out.
I like how you said that about the moss on the tree. Like, you know, you guys know the moss on the tree. Like, I have no idea. I just learned that today.
Yeah, an outdoors guy knows this stuff. You know, I kind of grew up in the woods, and so if you're ever lost, now I don't know what the sky looked like that day. We sort of figure if the sky is overcast, you're not sure where the sun is, so you can't use that for directions. But a person who's really skilled in the woods, there are a couple of techniques you use when you get lost. You look for the moss and you figure out which direction you're going in. You also can walk in a downward direction toward a waterway. And if you follow a waterway, you often find your way out. And if you know the area, you know where the waterways go. However, there was an important detail that I think gets omitted from a lot of the retellings of this story. People emphasize how Rivers was really knowledgeable about this area, and he was part of the area. But what some people remarked about, including Hollis Armstrong, the last person to see him, was he was walking into an area he was not as familiar with. And so I think that the assumption was he had kind of gone off the trail. He had gone into a place he didn't know quite as well and had probably gotten lost. But why he stayed lost, in my opinion, is the mystery.
Right, and there's no explanation for why he was heading that direction anyway.
No. I think we might be able to say at this point what probably didn't happen to him. Obviously, he didn't run away to start a new life. That's sort of the explanation. There's no evidence that could have happened, and he wasn't headed toward a bus station or a highway or anything like that. Was someone intentionally harming this guy? No evidence for that. No evidence of family discord. No evidence that this group of hunters were anything other than good friends or family members. even if he'd been accidentally killed by hunters, that doesn't really solve the problem of where he ended up. I've kind of thought this through, and I thought, well, if you accidentally kill someone hunting, obviously covering it up is morally reprehensible. We can say that. But there's the problem of a body. If he was placed in a clandestine grave, it would have to have been well concealed enough the searchers never found it, would have been deep enough that scavengers never opened it and scattered the remains. Ever tried to dig a hole in the woods? I used to dig saplings up in the woods and transplant them. It's hard labor. You're digging through roots and rocks. Hunters aren't carrying heavy digging equipment with them. They've got they might have a camp shovel or something. But I think it just doesn't, the idea that someone harmed him and then hid the body doesn't really solve any of the problems of his disappearance at all.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
The one thing that is never discussed, but probably should be discussed, is the possibility of a planned disappearance. Not a runaway, but it is an unfortunate fact that people who are suicidal have been known to go to an isolated place and kind of disappear themselves. Had he walked in a northerly direction, even though he wasn't too familiar with this area, he would have known if he kept walking for as long as he could walk, he would be on one of the slopes of Glastonbury Mountain, many miles removed from trails and the usual places hunters go. And that could have been a place where he did himself in. The problem is there's no evidence this guy was depressed or in bad health or had financial problems or had family problems. And if there had been, it's likely something that would have been mentioned. The police were pretty indiscreet in these days in talking about victims or missing people. And there was nothing about his personal life that was brought up as a reason why he would have disappeared. So even though that theory might be on the table, it's a theory that just doesn't have any evidence to support it.
Were there any reports of him having dementia or anything like that?
Nothing like that. And no suggestion that he was confused or could easily get confused. Now, you might assume that a guy who's 74 might be a little bit past his prime as far as being a really skilled outdoorsman. And is probably slowing down. But again, the newspapers are very frank about things like that. Today, we might be a little bit more, we might hedge our language a little bit more. But in those days, if they thought he was confused or had dementia, they would have come out and said it. And nobody said anything like that.
And I'm curious about the handkerchief again. Where was that turned into? Was it turned into the law enforcement? And does it still exist today?
That's a very interesting question. It was turned into the people who were engaged in the search for the body that weekend. And eventually it found its way into the hands of law enforcement. But it was viewed by his son-in-law, and it was viewed by someone else who knew him, saying, yeah, this is what he carried. And it was taken not just to the factory, but to the laboratory that the factory ran to check the paint sample. So it was clearly scrutinized. Now, whether any evidence exists from this case or whether any police files, that I don't know. Technically, you would assume that the file would never have been closed because it was never a solved case. And I do know that there is at least one file remaining for one of these people that we're going to talk about later. But whether or not that evidence still exists is unknown to me.
And you said that there was 30 cents in there, and we probably don't know how that was divided up. Like, was it 30 pennies or was it 3 dimes?
It was pocket change. It would probably have been like a quarter. It might have been like a couple of dimes and a nickel or a quarter. And it just seems like it was, it was like a change purse. Like he carried 30 cents around for, if he was in town and wanted to get a cup of coffee, he just knotted up in his handkerchief as sort of a makeshift change purse.
Okay. But my train of thought was whether or not it would blow further away, if the wind might have taken it, how heavy was that? And it's just such a, I don't know, odd thing to recover, thinking about all of the other things on his person that probably could have fallen off.
It is, yeah. I think it was probably heavy enough that it would have dropped on the site. There was speculation that he dropped it on his way in that particular weekend. And of course, if he went out there every weekend, he could have dropped it the weekend before.
Yeah.
So we don't know exactly when it was dropped there. But your question makes me think about the issue of waterways. Is it possibly fell into water and got washed away? The creeks that run through this area are very, very broad and very, very shallow. They're filled with rocks and sort of sandbars. In the springtime, when the snow melts, these creeks flood. At the time he disappeared, a heavy rainstorm moved through and the creeks were relatively high. But the creeks are not deep enough, or I think large enough, I think, that a body could disappear forever. And they would, and of course, if he had fallen in the creek and gotten washed downstream, he would have been washed down toward Route 9. I think it's probably extremely unlikely, if not impossible, that he would have gone into one of these creeks and never been found. There's an interesting little tidbit that comes up about this case. In some subsequent retellings, one article claimed that they found shotgun shells that they linked to his gun. But I can't find any evidence for that in the original articles. That may have been something that got misreported later on.
Yeah, it seemed like some inconsistencies in the later reporting.
Yeah.
Now, this might be an impossible question to answer, but where he was, would anyone have heard gunshots?
Good question. There were other hunters out in the woods that day, and there were gunshots heard. And of course, that raises the question of, if he fell and broke his ankle, would he have fired his gun to alert searchers to his location, which is what you would do, which you might consider doing if you had a gun. That was one of the questions they had, but they decided at some point that the gunshots they had heard were coming from other hunters, and it didn't sound like somebody firing his gun at the interval, at specific intervals, but rather it was just the gunshots of other hunters in the area.
And we had spoken about the family members from Etta Rael reaching out. Are there any known family members of Middie's that you are aware of that are still in the area?
None that I'm aware of, but I'm sure there are a few, because there were a lot of kids. Each generation back in those days had 6 or 7 kids. And so there were a number of people in the area. Some of his siblings were alive well into the mid-20th century. And his children, of course, would have been alive until recently. And there may be some close relatives still alive. But I've not seen any interviews or any sort of public statements from any of those individuals in the subsequent years since he disappeared.
And you mentioned the woman with the handkerchief. What was her name?
Her name is Clara Jepson.
Clara Jepson. Was she known as like a medium or a psychic? And did they find this dilapidated shed? What happened with that?
It was a dead end. They never found anything that she had stated. I think that Clara Jepson was better at finding things than she was at finding people. Because when they talked about the Lindbergh case and the Amelia Earhart case, nothing that she said about those cases seemed like it shed any light on the case. There was an interesting little sidebar or side item about Clara Jepson. Apparently, the day the handkerchief was found, one of Rivers' daughters went to see Clara Jepson and said to her, "They found something today. What was it?" And Jepson was able to say that it was a handkerchief. Now, this is one person's claim, obviously, but apparently, supposedly, she was aware once the handkerchief was found that was a fact. The area where Rivers disappeared, as I'd mentioned, had been an area where there was logging activity, half a century before. There were a lot of hunting cabins. So the idea that he might have found his way to a shelter of some kind isn't beyond the realm of possibility, but nothing that Jepson was able to provide ever led searchers to any sorts of clues that helped resolve the case or shed light on the case. And the name Jepson will come up later in our discussion about future events. So let's remember that name. She shows up again.
Okay, good. So then is your belief here with the disappearance of Middie Rivers, is it that he somehow made it out of the search radius and they just never found him, and that's simply why?
I think that's really the only explanation, that he wandered so far out of the search radius, out of areas where hunters tend to congregate, and he may have had a medical event of some sort. A heart attack can occur for a period of hours before it eventually debilitates you. Or he might have succumbed to the elements. I think we don't know. But whatever happened to him happened in a place that was remote enough, far enough off any trail that hunters, hikers, and searchers never found one trace of him. That's the only explanation that I think is reasonable. The area he was walking into, there weren't roads there where he would have been picked up by a car. There don't seem to be any significant cave systems in the area. It's not an area where there was mining. There are some caves in the area, but no one seemed to think that he fell down a cave hole or something like that. It just seems like he went into a remote area. And we see this with some missing persons cases where somebody disappears in an area that gets heavily searched and they're found in the same area. It's not impossible to overlook a person who's wearing tan, brown clothing. You're not going to necessarily see that easily. When fall leaves come, the leaves cover things up, the snow covers things up. So I think it was just that he's out there somewhere, but he just was never recovered.
I'm not an outdoors person per se. I don't know about the moss on the trees, but I think I know that bears would want to stock up, like for their hibernation in the winter, and November might be a good time to do that. Do you think a bear might have something to do with his disappearance?
I think that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought much about that. That was not something that searchers were discussing at the time. I'm sure there are bears in this area. We certainly have bears down in Massachusetts at various times. It's possible, but let's also remember, and it's kind of a gruesome fact, but if somebody dies in the woods, their body does become prey to scavengers, and oftentimes bones will be scattered over a large area. Hunters are very good at finding that stuff. Hunters are looking down, they're tracking game, they're looking for antlers. That's one of the reasons why if you read about missing persons cases, true crime cases, if there are human remains in the woods, it's not unusual they're found by hunters. So yes, that might have happened. But again, if it happened in a place that was so far away that no hunter ever located it, no hunter ever came across a stray bone, the heavy clothing he wore would have lasted for many, many years. The gun would have lasted for many, many years. The boots. Wherever he went, it was very, very far off the beaten track. And of course, Middie Rivers was on everybody's mind. That was sort of the big weird thing that was happening until December 1st, 1946, when Paula Weldon disappeared from the same general area. And that was the next story in this particular series.
All right, and we're back here for final thoughts after the conversation with Ross about the disappearance of Middie Rivers. Once again, he really delivers with his information, and I love how he pulls like old newspaper articles for these discussions, and it's always going to be endlessly fascinating to me to compare an original newspaper article to what happens so many years later and how things, facts literally get twisted. And it's always better to go back to the original stuff if you can.
Absolutely. And him being an archivist, that's just what he does, right? He's so used to doing that sort of legwork, going in and pulling these articles, and it does come with a couple of caveats, right? Because you'd said it's interesting to see how facts get twisted or they change over the course of the years, and this is obviously many, many years later, and different truths come out of different facts in order to make a story seem more, I guess, entertaining. And that's happened in many disappearances that we talk about. So that's one caveat. But the other one is, you also have to keep in mind there might be some impulsive writing that happens too, right off the bat. And I think that's what happens sometimes with the other supernatural elements in these other geographic locations, is that a lot of times people will read something and then they have this impulse to say, there's this lost horizon that people are just disappearing into. So you do have to take everything with a grain of salt. But all that being said, the newspaper articles that Ross had sent us and the ones that we were all working off of seemed very like matter of fact. It seemed like the reporting was very fact-based and didn't really drift into any theorizing.
Right. Well, I'm kind of more speaking about how when I was searching online, I found one outlet. I don't think it was too professional of like a news outlet. I think it was more of a blog, but it said that his bones had been found, which, is not true. I also found one that said that he was walking with a group of hunters and then he ran ahead, which is not the story as we went through it with Ross. So yeah, I don't even know if those ones are intentionally trying to be, create a narrative. It's just wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's the point I was trying to make in a really long-winded way is instead of him simply speaking with somebody who was part of a group of hunters and walking in the other direction, someone took that and said he was with a group of hunters and ran ahead. And I don't know where that connection happened in their head, but it makes for a much more entertaining story.
Right, that's the Polly Melton
yes.
story. When I read that, I was like, oh, that's the same thing that happened to Polly Melton. And then I find out that wasn't the case at all. But the idea of the Lost Horizon that was written about in those articles, that is kind of wild to have made newspaper articles back then. That's more of the kind of thing where I would expect like people theorize and it ends up on blogs and, then there's a whole thing that exists in the Vermont woods that no one ever knew about or whatever,
Yeah. But I don't think Lost Horizon came up until maybe the third disappearance. I don't think it was with Middie's disappearance.
Yeah, pretty wild, pretty weird. I mean, it is a weird disappearance, there seems to be no explanation for him walking away from the camp, and no known explanation at least. He knew the woods. He was an outdoorsman. We don't believe he was having like mental issues, dementia, anything like that. It was not like a silver alert situation that we're aware of. It sounds like he got out of the search radius. I think that's a very fair sort of expectation with this case. But I don't know. Do you think that he committed suicide up there? Was he going to commit suicide?
I don't think so. I think the guy had lived, we pointed out, 13 years beyond. I don't think they knew what their life expectancy was back then, but they probably had an idea. Like once you're past 60, you're sort of on like borrowed time at that point. And he was 73 or 74. So yeah. I think at that point, like, I don't think he's going to be committing suicide. Ross had a couple of really good points. One thing that he brought up was sometimes the hunters will have knowledge about a location where they know the pheasants are going to be or something to that effect. And maybe he wanted to get out there to his special location because he was hunting. And I think that's the most reasonable thing in my head is that's why he walked away. He was out there hunting. And if we're just using, the simplest thing is the simplest thing theory here, he went out to go hunt somewhere that he didn't want the other hunters to know about. They didn't wear like the bright orange, so I could see him being accidentally shot, but Ross had another point. Like, who's covering that up? Who's digging in the ground and hiding a body and getting away with murder? I don't see that being a thing. So,
and it would be an accident anyway, so it wouldn't even be something that you would want to need to cover up.
I know, right? Like, most people, I think, if they were to find themselves in that accidental situation, would live with the fact that they accidentally shot somebody and they would alert help. I mean, the guy probably wouldn't be immediately dead, so they would probably want to try to find help to make sure he doesn't die. I don't think, I hope anyway, people don't immediately go to, I got to cover this up. I have to get a shovel. Like, I got to go get a shovel and temporarily hide the body while I find a shovel, and then I'm going to dig. And as Ross told us, it's not easy to dig in the wilderness. Ross taught us a lot about the wilderness, by the way. The moss on the tree. Never knew that. That would have come in handy a few times in my youth. So I don't know. It's a reasonable theory to have that maybe he was shot by accident, but again, like, who's covering that up without being noticed?
Yeah, the second half of that doesn't make too much sense. I don't know. So I'm kind of left with suicide, to be honest. Like, because I don't know what else. Like, I don't think he stumbled into a lost horizon. And I think if he twisted an ankle or something and was alive, he would have tried to alert people. He would have shot his gun. I don't know how many rounds he had on him, but he would have made noises, tried to, if he knew the woods so well. The only other thing I can think of is maybe like he was trying to hunt and he just got twisted and around, but it sounded like he was more of an outdoorsman than would be able to sort of get lost like that. But
yeah, I mean, I could see suicide.
My argument for it is your point actually too. He's beyond the typical age that most men live to. Maybe he had some terminal illness that was going to get him in a worse way, or maybe he was dealing with pain that you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Or something that we didn't know, and he just didn't want a slower death or something like that. But then I look at like, well, he's got a shotgun on him. That might be kind of difficult to pull off. So I don't know. I really don't know. But I think that's I typically will lean towards suicide in some of these cases. I feel like.
Yeah, he would have had to have walked like way outside of the search radius. I guess not way outside. He would have had to have walked outside the search radius, and nothing of his person was ever found. Even his gun. That was a good point that Ross made, that even if it's suicide or no matter what it is, his gun was never found. And his gun isn't going to degrade.
Right, but if you're planning to never like be found, then, there's no limit to where you would go.
True.
Like he might have just went walked as far as he could or whatever.
I am very excited to talk about the other disappearances too, because there's no supernatural element here. It is very fact-based and human. It's a human being, and the exploration into someone's emotional state during this time, I feel like is very valuable, especially when we do what we do here on this show, trying to figure out the mindset of somebody who's wandered off the trail and never to be seen again. I am impressed with the town, by the way. I just want to say this. The town was so attuned, maybe that's the word I'm looking for, to missing people, that they had the series of 3 sirens 3 times. And if you heard that in the town, you knew that was the call to search?
Organize a search party.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
So impressive. So if you're sitting there having your lunch and you hear it, you cancel what you were about to do for the rest of the day or for the next few hours because it's a call to action that the town needs you for. That's incredible to me. If that happened here, if I heard that, I would probably hide. Because I don't know what's happening. There's a sirens going off, and that's bad.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just a different way to communicate with people. Today there would probably be like some kind of text alert or something like that.
You're right. There would be some alert on your phone that would pop up.
So I do just want to mention these other disappearances as part of the Bennington Triangle. There's Paula Weldon from 1946. There's James Tedford from 1949. Paul Jepson from 1950. Frida Langer from 1950. And so those are all right in that 5-year time period in the same area. So it is a bit peculiar for sure.
Definitely peculiar, and I cannot wait for Ross to rejoin us and examine each one of these stories. And a quick side note on Ross. We spoke briefly about Etta Reel and the work that he did and the episode that he did with us. And he talked about how family members had contacted him based on the episode. And it was really cool to see somebody experience that for the first time. We've had family members reach out to us, and I remember that feeling the first time a family member reaches out. You feel really nervous at first because you want to make sure all of the information that you just put out there is accurate. And it's rewarding when you start reading the message and they start off with saying, "Thank you so much for." And then you realize, okay, that's cool. Like, even if there were mistakes, they at least appreciate the effort to keep this person's name in some sort of spotlight. And even if you do make mistakes, they're very respectful about it. They say, I just want to point out a couple of small things, probably doesn't have anything to do with anything, but in respect to this person, here are a couple of errors.
Yeah.
And they did that with Ross, but it was so cool to see him react to that for the first time. He was genuinely surprised and also flattered and humbled by it. And you just tell, like, he just thought it was such a fulfilling thing. Like, he put together all of this research, went on the show, delivered it perfectly, and he got a direct response, and really rewarding for him.
Yeah, very cool. Before we go, Lance, I did just want to mention one part of that interview that I forgot to mention earlier. It's Clara Jepson. I believe she was referred to as a psychic or a seer. And that just was so like almost cinematic when Ross was describing her. And you can look her up, Clara Jepson. It's Jepson, and there's still information online about her today, and she died in the 1940s. Yeah, 1948. So she was alive so long before the internet, and died before it was invented, and there's still writings of her. So I don't know. She must have been pretty influential.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. When you told me that you had found her online, and then, we just had this reflective moment of like, you were like, she died in 1948, and she still is like, she's still hitting in the top search for Google. Like, yeah. That's really cool. Must have had a huge influence.
Absolutely. So, all right, everyone, I hope you really enjoyed this interview with Ross Griffiths and this episode of Missing. Please follow us on social media. Wherever you're at, we're probably there too, at Missing CSM. Thanks a lot for listening.